And we are now recording this class.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay, great. Can you still see it? When I go full screen?
Yep, I can see it just fine.
Okay.
I can see it too.
Okay, great.
And I've always wanted to hear your voice, Lady Armstrong.
Well, I'm not Lady Armstrong, actually.
Oh.
I'm sorry.
No, I don't want to hear your voice then. No.
Yeah. So I'm in Lady Armstrong's belt line. I'm a page under Valkyrie, who is under Lady Armstrong. So yeah, that's why I have the same last name, but she's Revel Armstrong.
Oh,
Is
okay.
her
I
actual name.
apologize.
That's okay. I know she's does great work, but and I learned a lot of what I know from her, so it's kind of secondary. But so for everyone here, I'm Runa. Like I said, I am page to Valkyrie, who's man at arms or woman at arms to Lady Armstrong, who is squire to Lyndon Toole. And this is intro to Applique, or how to get fancy designs on your garb. And I'm going to go ahead and get started. So what is applique? Because when I first started sewing, I had no idea like what applique even was. So I figured I'd start with this. But basically it's just applying decoration to a piece of fabric with another piece of fabric, usually, cut into a shape or design. Here's some examples of stuff that I've done, both, more simple and more complicated. And this is going to focus on machine applique, which is what I'm most familiar with. People can and do it by hand, but I don't have the patience for that. So I tend to work with machine sewing. So just some basic terms to kind of get us started that you may hear come up in this. So a stay stitch is a straight stitch that we put along the edge of an applique piece. And that just kind of helps with stability and durability. For a satin stitch is that applique stitch that goes around the piece, and that's how you get that really thick decorative stitch. So like you can see around the edges of these designs. And it's just a really tight zigzag stitch, but people refer to it as a satin stitch. And then you may hear turned or quilter's applique come up, this is a different method of applique where you basically cut out the shape and then you just kind of fold the edge under and then you straight stitch it down. So it can be really good for people who are a little intimidated by applique, but you can't get as complicated designs with it because there's only so much, folding you can do. And then reverse applique is the same kind of process, but instead of like cutting out a design and applying it to your tunic, you, for example, cut a hole out of your tunic and put a piece of fabric behind it and then stitch around the hole. So it's just kind of reverse. And it creates kind of a different look that some people like. So just a different method. Materials that you need. This is just in general for applique and stuff that I'm going to be mentioning in this class. So fabric in 2 colors. I prefer to work with linen myself, but cotton is great too, especially if you're just practicing. But really you just want something that is not a stretch material. Because when you're trying to applique, the satin stitch tends to kind of pull on the fabric, and if you have a stretchy material, it can be difficult to work with. I've done it, but I wouldn't recommend it. So all-purpose thread, this is kind of optional, and I'll get to why in a second, but generally, when people first start out, what I did, especially, and what I see a lot of people do, is they just use the generic all-purpose thread from the store, and it just doesn't look as smooth on the top of the applique. So like if I go back to these examples, you can kind of see how the stitching is actually like shiny and it's really smooth looking. And And that comes from using embroidery thread, which I use the Sulky brand. There's other brands out there, but it's just a shinier, kind of smoother thread. But it is rather expensive. And as you can imagine from that tight stitching, you're going to use a lot of it. So I like to use embroidery thread on the top where you're going to see it, and all-purpose thread for the bobbin or the bottom of the piece, because no one's going to see that. If you may have to adjust your machine tension for that a bit. So some people prefer to just use all embroidery thread, and that's fine. I just like to kind of cut down on the cost a little bit by using all-purpose thread as well. So you want to match the colors as close as possible to your design piece, or sometimes, like in this example with the griffins, you might use a contrasting thread to kind of give it an extra design element. So lightweight fusible interfacing. So this is what helps the design piece or the applique piece stick to the tunic, so that it doesn't move around while you're sewing it. I like to use Heat and Bond Light. There's other like brands that you can use. Some people swear by like the heavier Heat and Bond, but I've heard that that can like gum up your sewing machine. So I don't take the risk, and I just use Heat and Bond Light. And it's just a lot easier to tear away than some other brands. And then some kind of tear away stabilizer. So you put stabilizer on the bottom as you're sewing, and I'll show you this later, but it just kind of helps hold everything in place, and it helps things move better and not like warp out of shape. So you can get like embroidery stabilizer, or you can get like iron-on versions. I just like look for tear away stabilizer and find like the cheapest one I can get. Sometimes you can use tissue paper even if you're in a pinch. And then lastly, not lastly, but next, you're going to need a printed or drawn image sized appropriately. So you want whatever image you're trying to use to be the size you want it to be when it goes on the tunic or the belt flag or whatever you're making. So I'll resize my images in like Photoshop or Canva is another free program, and then just print them at that size. And if you're doing a really big piece, sometimes I will take my image to like a print shop and get it printed on really big paper, or I'll just print it in pieces and like tape those together. Next, fray check. So fray check is just like it's like a fabric glue kind of, and it stops the thread from fraying. So I like to dab it on at the end when I cut off my strings, just to keep it from unraveling. But you don't have to do that. It's just optional. And then a sewing machine, of course, because like I said at the beginning, we're focusing on machine applique here. If you were doing it by hand, you would use your embroidery needle and thread and whatever else. Then a pair of just fine tip fabric scissors, because it really helps to kind of clip the threads closely and just trim things up, and really get in there. And then a chalk pencil. So the method I'm going to show you for tracing your designs, you don't actually have to use chalk in any capacity, but sometimes I like to go over it with chalk or a chalk pencil, just because it helps it stand out better. But the chalk pencil, as opposed to just a piece of chalk, helps you get kind of finer details. You could also use like a fabric marker, but I'm always like nervous those aren't going to wash out, so I like the chalk because I know it'll just wash right out. All right. Any questions about materials or equipment or anything before I move on? I don't know if there's anything in the chat.
I don't see anything in the chat.
Okay. All right. So I heard a ding. Okay. So I'm going to move on. Okay. So what makes a good applique design? So this is kind of recommendations for when you're starting out, because as you get more practice, you can get more complicated designs, of course, but when you first start out, you want to start simple. There's no reason to overcomplicate things, because you'll just kind of discourage yourself. And I definitely did that starting out. So this is like from experience. I know that it's really easy to get discouraged and feel like, oh, why doesn't mine look as good? But it just takes time and it takes practice, like with any craft. So I'm going to be showing you guys some examples on this like shield design that I have here, because it's kind of a good basic shape. It's got some straight lines, it's got some curves, it's got a little point, you know, so it helps you practice kind of some basic techniques. And it's a thing that shows up a lot in AmpGuard. So it's just a good shape to practice on. You don't want to use too many colors starting out. You can, you know, use contrasting color thread. That's fairly simple to kind of add some design. You can do like layers of applique as you get more practice to do different colors. But again, that's just going to be more complicated. And really any design, you have to think about like how it's going to translate to the fabric. So something that has a lot of tiny little details is going to be very difficult for you to translate or transfer. So some designs just aren't as good for applique. You also don't want your design to be too thin in any place. So like, for example, with this shield, it's got a thin black line, but I'm not going to be doing just the black line. I'm going to cut out the shield shape and then go around that. Because if you get your applique too thin, then the thread will kind of just cover up the fabric and then it just doesn't look as good. It's just not quite the same. You want to look for a slightly higher resolution image just so it's easier to resize, but don't worry too much if it's a little bit blurry because you're just tracing the basic shape. You don't have to have like a perfectly clear image. And then again, print it at the design or print the design at the size you want your applique. So, and a thing to remember if you're printing is a lot of printers at home will like try to fill up the whole page. So you want to look at your settings and make sure that you're printing like actual size so you don't get messed up. And then the first step is to prep your fabric. So wash everything ahead of time. That helps. That's a good general tip for sewing anything, but wash your fabrics because you don't want it to shrink or warp or fray or anything, you know, after you finish the piece. So wash it ahead of time, iron it super well. Depending on your fabric. So like cotton and linen can take kind of a really high heat iron with a lot of steam, and that's really great. If you're using like a more delicate fabric, make sure you look up like what the recommended settings are for that fabric, because you don't want to like melt your fabric if you're working with like a polyester or something. If you're working on a tunic, which I kind of, talk about tunics a lot because that's what we see most of the time. But all of this applies to like a belt flag or a banner or any other, item. But if you're working on a tunic or something, for example, I don't like to like sew the whole piece and then try to applique it because you have to work through like the neck hole and stuff, and you have to like, it's more difficult to move it around. So what I do is I will sew like if I'm appliquing the back of a tunic, for example, I will sew like the shoulder seam and the collar just so that I can see like where those are placed and then place my applique accordingly. And then I will sew up the sides and finish it at the end. And like in general, you shouldn't end up with, if you've measured your tunic correctly, you shouldn't have any problems with that. So measure twice, cut once, all that. If sewing on a belt flag or whatever, you just need to have enough space to maneuver. So like if you're sewing a belt flag with a pocket, I would maybe do your applique and then sew the pocket, basic stuff. And then make sure the grain on your applique fabric and base fabric line up. So this sounds a little complicated, but it's, like if you look at linen, especially, you can see the threads and you can see they kind of go up and down and side to side. And you just don't want like your tunic piece, the threads are going up and down, and then your applique piece is like diagonal to that, because as it gets washed and worn, it will tend to warp. Okay. Any questions before we move on? No?
Nothing in chat.
Okay, cool. So prep your design. So first oh, go ahead.
I thought my mute was off, so and when I realized you didn't hear what I was saying, I checked and
No problem.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I have two.
Mhm.
A couple slides ago, you meant there, yeah. Not too thin in any place. Could you re-explain that for me, please?
Yeah, so you have to think about like it's a little bit more like if you cut out like really thin strips of fabric and then you're trying to sew them on something, it's going to be hard to like work with them. But also it's just like your thread is going to cover a portion of your fabric. So the stitching, so like I'll go back to this front piece because you can see. So like the stitching is a certain width, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
don't want the fabric to be so thin that your stitching is going to like completely cover it up. And that also has to do with adjusting your stitch width as you go. So like you can see on the little trinities here, the stitches are a lot thinner than say on the bull or not the bull, the ram.
So
No animals.
hypothetically, if I wanted, and I don't, but I mean, we'll just say hypothetically, if I'm looking at wanting something and the actual color or the piece to be an
Mhm.
inch wide, then I would want to allot space on, we'll just say on either side, for the satin stitch. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah, so we'll kind of see this as we get into the example, but the satin stitch is going to come inside of the design. So the satin stitch is part of the design, but you have to think about like the width of it and if it's going to look too bulky. And also like for example on this Mockingjay, you can see the little line of the arrow. Like
Mm-hmm.
that would have just been so tiny because this whole thing is only about like 5 inches tall or wide total. So
Right.
that would have just been too tiny. So what I did instead of doing a strip of fabric there was I just did a straight stitch without fabric.
Okay.
So you just have to think about like what size your design is going to end up and if that's going to be too thin and then adjust accordingly. So sometimes you can use the straight stitch for finer details like on these griffins also and the little like feather pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it also like if your applique stitch gets too thin, it just doesn't look as nice. So you want to just kind of think about that when you're making your design. But I'll show you, you'll kind of see a little bit more about the satin stitch when I get to the example.
Okay, that's okay. I don't want to shoot you too far ahead.
No, you're
And
good.
then just a couple slides ago, I had a second question. I don't know if it was the last slide or the slide before. No, but I keep going. I'm sorry.
That's as far as we've gotten. So
Right.
is it materials or
I think it was materials.
guess what was the question?
Okay, so it was the that was, I'm an old person, so
That's
sometimes
okay.
I have to retrace my steps, and even then it doesn't work. My question, so when you were talking about um, uh, matching the fabric on
Mhm.
the, whether the bias or the and I'm right now the other
Oh,
word
that was
escapes
here.
me. Yeah,
The grain.
the
Yeah.
grain. So if can I relay back to you what I think I heard?
Yeah, sure.
Is that typically the main body is on the grain. And what I think I heard you say is when you lay out your applique piece, you want to make sure that it matches being on the grain and not on the bias.
Right. So that's if you cut your tunic on the bias, you want your applique piece to also
See,
be cut
that
on
was
the
the second
bias.
part of my question. Okay,
Yeah.
that
So
was, yep.
you just want them to match regardless. So like I think I don't know if y'all can still see me, but let me see. Let me go to Zoom. But basically just if your tunic is cut on the grain, you want your applique piece also cut on the grain, because if they're going different directions, then they'll warp differently as it gets
Right.
worn. So
I didn't know if you, I was wondering what does a person do if the main part of the piece is cut on the bias, and you, now that, you know, so just be consistent. It's either one or the other. That was,
Yep.
thank you.
No problem. Okay. So so then on to the next step, you just want to prep your design. Like I talked about, you know, printing out your design. So you can see kind of, you want to cut a piece of fabric in your applique color. So if your main tunic is one color and your applique is going to be another color, you cut out the applique color just a little bit bigger than your design. And then you also want to cut a piece of fusible interfacing that's about the same size. So just give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, but you don't have to have like a ton of extra. So, and then I'm going to actually transition to video so you can see this. Let me escape. Okay, so you guys can see me, I hope. And then,
Yep, we can see you.
okay, great. I'm going to transition. I'm going to actually transition the video to my phone. So I'm going to stop video here. And then I'm going to put video on my phone so you can see details a little bit closer. So give me 1 second. And I need to plug in my iron. That would be helpful. Okay. Sorry, guys, just 1 second here. Oops. Okay, so now you guys should be able to see my ironing board here. So I'm going to put this on my little tripod. Oops. My God. Sorry, 1 second. Bear with me. Okay, so here's my ironing board and my fabric. So I'm using this green as like my base fabric. So this is just a little piece because it's an example. But you know, if this would be your tunic or whatever in real life. So I'm just going to iron this super well, make sure there's no creases. And this is linen. So I've got my iron turned all the way up with steam. And just do a little bit here. Then I'm also going to iron my applique fabric super well. So this, I'm using this yellow as my applique fabric, mainly just to show contrast here. But you can use whatever colors you want, obviously. So iron that. And this is my design that I've printed out. And as you can see, the fabric is just a little bit bigger than the design. So I have a little bit of, you know, space to work with. And I've already cut my heat and bond. And you can see there's like a shiny side. And so I'm going to put the shiny side face down onto the fabric. If you're using a fabric that has like a pattern or there's like a wrong side of the fabric, you want to make sure the heat and bond goes on the wrong side so that the right side is facing out. But with linen, it's the same on both sides in this solid color. So use whatever setting your package of your fusible interfacing says to use on your iron, because they're all different and I don't really know all of them. But I like to kind of put the paper down first, and there's like this paper backing. And I like to iron on the paper side first just because it's easier to get it flat. And so we iron it just a quick pass and you can see it's sticking already. And then I will flip it over and iron on the other side just to make sure that it's definitely stuck. So the heat and bond or the fusible interfacing, it really just holds the fabric in place. Like ultimately your stitching is doing the real work, but you still definitely want it for that extra sticking. So now we can see we've got paper on one side, fabric on the other. I'm going to peel off this paper backing. Throw that away. And then we've got this like shiny, sticky part. And we're going to put that onto our base tunic. Actually, I missed a step. I'm sorry. Before we iron it on, we have to cut out our shape. Duh. So actually, and I'm sorry, I messed up here. Really, you should trace your shape before you peel off the backing. But if you mess up like I did, it's not the end of the world. So I'm going to bring you guys over to my desk so I can show you how I trace the shape of my applique piece. Ignore my messy office. Sorry. So, okay. So you can see this is my applique fabric with the heat and bond attached to the back. And then I'm going to lay my design over top of it like this. And then I had a pencil here. Here we go. I'm going to take either a pencil or a pen, and I'm just going to trace around the outside of the design, pressing firmly into the paper, but not so firmly that, you know, I tear through it. So this is a mechanical pencil with the lead not extended, and I find that works pretty well. Or you could just use a ballpoint pen or whatever, but you just kind of want to go over it around the design. Oops, and I'm tearing the paper a little bit, but that's okay. So you're just rubbing it kind of like you would make like a relief rubbing or something. And you just want to hold this as much in place as you can and not let the design move as you're going. You may need to like pin it if it's a really big, complicated design. And as you can see, is like there's a line around here. I'm just going around the outer line because that's the general shape I want. If you were doing multiple, if you're doing a section with like a cutout, for example, you would go around the inside too. But I like to do this because like if I had, say, a shield and then I had like a shape in the middle that I wanted to trace, like a circle or something, or like, you know, whatever. And if I had like a heraldry in the middle that I wanted to trace and then fill in with either like straight stitches or hand embroidery or something, or if I wanted to cut it out, then I could trace around that as well. And then I would have both my lines. When you trace like kind of a traditional way, you have to cut it out and trace around the edge. And I just have always hated tracing around the edge of things. So that's why I do this. You can also, what some people do is they will flip it over and trace their design with pencil or pen on the reverse side on the paper, because the backing of heat and bond is just paper. But if you do that, you have to remember to reverse your design because it's going to be flipped around when you put it on the tunic. Okay, I see a question. If your designs have layered pieces, do you start with the smallest first? So no, actually, I will start with the biggest piece. Well, that depends. So typically when I do a layered design, it'll have multiple colors. So I'll start with the biggest piece, which is like the background. So say I had this shield and then there was like um, a whatever on it, like a whatever's a heraldry thing, a cat or something, you know. Say I had this shield and then there was like a smaller shield on top of that, or an animal or something. Then I would cut out my design for the shield. Then I would get my alternate color, cut out the design for the symbol, like the smaller shield or the animal or whatever, cut that out, and then heat and bond that on top of the other piece, and then heat and bond the whole thing to the tunic. So I'm going to share my screen again real quick, just because I have a picture of this actually. So at the end, so you can see this griffin here. So how I did this is the whole background of this is red. And so I cut out the shape in red, and then I traced the gold parts. So I had my image printed multiple times, and I traced the gold parts in gold. And then I cut those out and laid them on top of the red and heat and bonded the whole thing down. And then I did the green parts and so on. So you kind of just work in layers. When I'm stitching it, I will stitch the inner parts first. So the smaller details, I'll stitch those first, and then I'll stitch the outer around the whole edge. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. So now that I've got this, it is,
Sorry, I also had a question.
yeah, go ahead.
Specifically more about if you had like an original design, would you digitize it first to then create like the pattern or whatever, or how would you go about that?
So I don't deal with original designs a lot because I'm not very good at drawing. But if I did, what I've seen some people do is if they're just drawing it, you could either just draw it in chalk pencil straight on the fabric. So like once you have the heat and bond on, you would just draw it in chalk pencil. Or you could reverse it and draw it on the back because it's just paper. Or if it was me doing it and like someone had drawn something for me, then yeah, what I would do is digitize it or get like a picture of it even, and then print it to the right size so that I could work with it. And I'm just going over this again to make sure. Sometimes you will go through your fabric or go through your paper, and that's okay. So it's a little hard to see, and you can see my pencil like went through my paper a little bit, but that's okay. You won't be able to see it when we're done. So I'm going to try to see. You can kind of see, gosh, this is really harder on lighter colored fabric, which is why I will go over it in chalk pencil if it's kind of hard to see like this. So, but if it's on darker fabric, you really see it pop. So like you can kind of see right there. Whoops. There's like that faint little line that you made by tracing your outline. And it shows up a lot better in person than on camera. So I hope y'all don't think I'm like lying to you here. I'm sorry. But I'm going to grab a chalk pencil and trace this over just so I can see it a little better. And then we will cut it out. But again, if you're having trouble, like if this isn't working for you, especially for really simple designs, then you can just cut it out and trace it normally. If it's a design like the shield that is symmetrical, you don't even have to worry about reversing it and you can trace it on the back. But if it's not, you want to pay attention to that. So I'm just going over and tracing that little line that I made with the chalk pencil just so it's easier to see. And I will especially do this if I had like details on the inside that I want to keep, because as you work with it, it's going to be harder to keep track of, you know, where all your lines are. So you want to really make them stand out. And you may have to even go over it with the chalk again later if you find that it's disappearing, like with your little details. And again, like someone asked, if you wanted to draw your own design, this is where a chalk pencil is really helpful, because it's really almost like a pencil and you can kind of just doodle in here and make your design. Or again, you can flip it over and draw on the paper on the back with a normal pencil. So now we're going to cut it out. And I tend to use like these smaller scissors for cutting out designs just because I want to get like more control and kind of closer up to things. But if you have a really big piece, you can use bigger scissors. It's whatever you feel comfortable with. Any more questions while I'm cutting this out? You may notice like where I kind of pressed too hard and it came through the paper a little bit, there's a pencil mark. That's okay because that's going to be covered up by the satin stitch, and I'm also like cutting right along it. So if that happens, don't freak out. But I just don't want it to be something that's going to bleed like a marker or something. So that's why I tend to use pencil or pen. But so here's our shield shape. You can see it's just our basic shape here. And then now I've already peeled off the heat and bond, but if you hadn't, at this point you would peel it off, and then we're going to iron this onto our tunic or whatever we're making. So let's go back over to the ironing board. I'm sorry if moving the camera around makes anyone dizzy. I hope it doesn't. So now again, we've got our iron still hot. We've got our base tunic piece. Or our base fabric piece. Imagine it's a tunic. And I'm just going to iron this again real quick just to double ensure that it's flat. And again, you can see this is where you can kind of see that grain coming into play. So this is cut on the grain. You can kind of see how the threads run here. And then our applique piece is also cut on the grain. I don't know if you can see it on the yellow, but it's there. So we're going to place this up and down where we want it positioned. If you have like a tunic or something and you want to make super sure that it's centered, you could measure it and find like the middle and make a mark and line up your stuff that way. For the sake of this, I'm just going to eyeball it because it's just an example. But this, like if this was the top of a tunic, this is why I sew up the shoulders, because the collar, if you have like a decorative collar, is going to come down a little bit. So I want to make sure that my applique piece is not too close to the collar. So that's why I do it that way. And then once it's placed where you want it, I'm going to just iron it down. Again, follow whatever instructions your fusible interfacing says to use. Some brands you want to like leave it sit there for a minute and really like make sure that it's stuck because you don't want it to like come up as you're working with it. That's annoying. But for this brand, you don't really have to leave it that long. It just works. And now we have one piece essentially. And of course, this is 2 layers. So it's always going to be a little thicker where the applique is. And that's where you have to be careful with getting multiple layers of applique, because it will get really thick and stiff after a while. So I'm going to go ahead and move over to the sewing machine. If anyone has questions, please shout them out, and bear with me just a moment. I'm going to turn off my iron. Okay. So this is my sewing machine and my sewing desk. Here we are. Oops. Okay. So at this point, you don't really need your design anymore. So I'm just going to set that aside. And I'm going to cut a piece of stabilizer that's, again, slightly bigger than the design. And this is my roll of stabilizer. I got it on Amazon for like $30 and it lasts forever. But you can get it at, you know, craft stores or whatever. If you're doing something like a trim, you want to, you may need to like cut it in strips and layer multiple pieces depending on the size of your roll. And that's totally okay. It's not really going to hurt anything. So here's my stabilizer, a little bit bigger. I'm going to flip this over. So I'm now on the back of the piece. And I'm going to pin the stabilizer to the back. And you want to make sure that it has covered the applique still, and you can kind of tell just by feeling it around the edge that, you know, that's a thicker area, or you can, you know, flip it over and just kind of eyeball it. But that's why I cut it bigger, to make sure it covers everything. I'm just going to pin this at the corners. If you have iron-on stabilizer, this is the part where you would iron it in place. Sometimes I'll still pin the iron-on stuff because I don't trust it, but depends on your how experienced you are with it. Okay. Oh gosh, how are we? It's 12:44. I realize we're kind of a little slow on time here. We're doing a little badly on time here, but I will get through the rest of this as quickly as possible. Okay. So
There is
here's our
not another class in this room until 1 o'clock. So if
Okay,
you do
great.
go a little over, that's okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm always like, it depends on how quickly and how many questions we have. So, okay. And this is being recorded. So if anyone has to leave, then you can watch it later. So here's our piece with our stabilizer. I'm now gonna pull up my sewing machine. I've already got it threaded. So you can see I've got my embroidery thread on top, and this is, you can see how it's, whoops. You can see how it's shinier than like a regular roll of all-purpose thread. So like I've got this red that I'm using as my bobbin thread, and it's not quite the same color, but it's pretty close. But you can see how much shinier the embroidery thread is, and that's Sulky brand. And I've got my bobbin threaded. So I'm gonna try to figure out the best angle for you guys here. Move you around a little bit. Oops, not quite. There we go. Okay, and again, you can use embroidery thread in both your bobbin and your top. I just like to save a little money by using all-purpose thread. So we want to set our tension maybe so that the top is pulling on it slightly less. So if your average is like a 4, I maybe start out with a 3 just to be safe, because we don't want that all-purpose thread to, you know, show up down the line. So, and we're going to set our machine to a zigzag stitch. So mine is a 4, but whatever yours is. And then you're going to set the width depending on the width of your fabric. So for this one, it's a pretty solid piece. It's a pretty big design. So I'm going to do the maximum width, also because it, you know, will let you guys see it a little bit better. And I'm also using this red thread because it just kind of helps you guys see the applique a little bit better. You can use matching thread, of course, as well. So I'm also going to set the length of my stitch basically as low as it will go without being 0. So mine is a digital machine, so it's like a 0.1. But if yours has a knob, I used to, when I had that type of sewing machine, I would just set it to 0 and then do it like the tiniest bit up from 0. Because if you do it right at 0, it's not going to go anywhere, but you want it to be, you know, tight as well. And then I'm going to position it. you can kind of see how I'm positioning my needle so that it is right at the edge of the fabric. So I want most of my stitch to be inside the fabric and just barely covering the edge. You don't want the fabric to show, but by having it more in, then it's going to cover more of the fabric, which makes it more stable. And it's less likely to like pull up later. So I hope you guys can see that okay. And so I start by putting my needle down just so it doesn't tug out. And then I'm just going to start sewing. And you just want to kind of go slowly at first and just kind of slowly guide it forward. You shouldn't have to like push on it really hard. And that's the stabilizer helps it move smoothly. And it also keeps this design from getting like warped as you kind of tug on it. So we're just going to keep going slowly, following the edge. And really the key to this like is just take it slow, practice, you know, as you first start out, and you'll just kind of get more confident with it as you go. I'm getting to a curve here. So I just kind of gradually turn the fabric with the shape. And that's where it helps to have your tunic not sewed up or whatever, so you can move it a lot better. And if I get to a point where I feel like the curve is moving faster than I can turn it, like if it's a really sharp curve, what I'll do is I'll stop, put the needle down on the outer edge, or depends on which direction you're turning. So since I'm kind of turning it to the left or kind of moving left, I want it on the right side. And then I lift my foot, rotate the fabric, and then back down and start again. And that's how you get those nice smooth curves. And if you're doing something with a really tight curve, you're probably gonna have to do that a lot. And that's okay. So I'm just gonna keep going. I'm speeding up a little bit just so we can get through this. But it's okay to go quickly. You just don't wanna go so quickly that like you're not in control, I guess is the moral of the story. And then once I get to the end here at the point, I don't want to go over it too far. So basically I've got it so that the needle is right on the point. Again, it's kind of hard to see here from my phone, but if I lift my foot, maybe you can see it a little better. You can see the needle's kind of right on the point that I'm going to turn on. And then I'm going to rotate the fabric so that I'm starting to go in the other direction and then put it back down. And one thing some people ask me about is the type of foot. It definitely helps to have an entirely clear plastic foot, or one like this where it has a clear front at least, so that you can see what you're doing. I have used a metal foot. It's just a little bit more difficult. And if your sewing machine doesn't come with like a clear plastic foot or like a one with a clear or open front, you can get one on, you know, for pretty cheaply. So I'm gonna just keep going up the side, and I'm gonna stop here just to kind of show you guys what it looks like. And you pull out and trim off your thread, of course. And then you can see you have like this smooth, satiny looking stitch. And you will see like a little bit of like more dots around the edge, like more light coming through, but that's okay. If I can get it in the light, you can see how shiny it is better, but oh gosh. So you can kind of see how it's shiny. You may notice you can see some of the background color coming through a little bit. And that's definitely going to be more true with contrasting colors like this. But if you ever notice that, like if your stitches don't seem tight enough, typically when you see that super smooth, super tight applique, they've gone over it twice. So you do the whole stitching once and then you go over it again. And that seems really painstaking, but that's how you get that look. If you're using, like, I've noticed darker colors with a matching thread will show through less. It's less obvious. So if you don't want to go over it twice, that's how you get away with it. But just in general, that's what you do. And then I'm going to show you, I'm going to go over this once more. Whoops, I didn't cut that. Oh, okay. So I'm going to go over a small section of this again, just to, and then show you how I tie off my applique. Oh no, sorry about that. Oops. Okay. Ah, sorry, my tripod is decided to be unstable right now, of all times. Okay, hopefully that stays. So on the first pass through, if you're doing a second pass through, I just clip off my threads completely on both the beginning and the end. But if you are doing the second pass through, we're going to do it a little differently. So I'll show you how that looks. And you can see on the back here how my thread looks a little different because that is the all-purpose thread. And I would rather have some of the embroidery thread show on the back than have some of the all-purpose thread show on the front. But you can experiment with your tension and kind of see what works for you. All right, so I've trimmed that. I'm just going to go over like this little end piece so I can show you how I tie it off. So like, again, if you're going over it the second time, just kind of pick a place to start. It doesn't really matter where you start. And then just go over it again. And you may notice it's a little more difficult as you go over it the second time. And especially with thicker fabrics or like multiple layers, you're going to have a harder time pushing through. That's where that stabilizer is important, and just take it slow and, you know, do the best you can. And eventually, like, you may find that some super thick fabrics are just not conducive to applique, and that's just how it is. So after my second pass through, you can again see how shiny that is. Whoops, if I can get it angled right here. You can kind of see how shiny that is. And you can see how much like smoother. Uh-oh, did I freeze? There we go. Come on. You can kind of see how much smoother that is than where it was before. And it just looks more solid. So now to finish it, or to tie it off, because I don't want my threads to come unraveled. Ooh, oh my God. Okay, I'm sorry. Tripod is not cooperating with me today. It tried so hard. Okay. Let's try that. So because I don't want my threads to unravel and ruin my beautiful applique, so what I'm going to do is flip. I've got these long threads that I've left. Kind of, you can see I've kind of got these long extra threads. So I'm going to flip it over. And you can see I've got my back thread as well. And I'm going to take my seam ripper or just a pencil or whatever, or your scissors or whatever skinny object you have, because I can't find my seam ripper. Oh. Okay, well, that's fine. So I'm going to take this thread, this back thread, and kind of tug on it. And you can see, if you look really closely, there's a loop of the front thread coming through to the back. So I'm just going to grab it and pull it through. And now I've got two threads there. And then I'm going to tie a knot. And if you're on your second layer, you may find that it's not coming through. Like if it doesn't tug very easily, if it feels like you're going to tear it trying to pull it through, then just don't worry about it. Just snip it off and dab it with some fray check, because if it's not going to pull through easily, it's not going to come undone easily. So I'm just going to tie that in a simple knot and then trim off my threads. Oops. And I'm going to leave a little bit of like tails, because I don't want that knot to come undone, but you don't want to leave like a big long thread there either. And then I'm going to take my fray check, which this is what it's just a little bottle of clear stuff. And I like to use a Q-tip or something like that to kind of dab it on, because that just gives me more control over it. And you can reuse the same Q-tip multiple times, or you can dab it directly, but be careful not to put too much, because if it bleeds through, it can possibly stain your fabric, and you don't want that. So I'm going to just dab it on my Q-tip just a little bit, and then dab it right there on that knot so that it stays in place. And I just do that anywhere that I have threads. So like at the beginning and end of your stitch. You just do that everywhere. And that's pretty much it. Once you're done, you trim up all your threads, and then you've got your applique piece. Yeah. Any questions about that at this point?
I'm going to go ahead and end the recording queue.
Yeah, sounds good.